Hey everyone, good to see you. What you're about to watch is a conversation that Colin Smith and I had with Bob Kettle, a Seattle City Council member. And like Colin and me, Bob previously served as a White House social aide, as many of you did as well. We talked about leadership, public service, and Bob's journey from serving as a White House social aide to shaping policy in Seattle. As a quick aside, if you haven't seen it, check out last year's conversation with Colin. He's an impressive guy, and it was a terrific conversation. This conversation with Bob was filmed earlier in the year. One way you can tell is that I mentioned Bob's confidence that the Seattle Seahawks were going to do well in the playoffs, which they obviously did, and Bob was right. Great discussion with Bob. Hope you enjoy it. Bob Kettle, welcome to our interview series. Great to see you again, Bob.
Well, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We also have a special guest interviewer, Colin Smith, a star of last year's interview. Colin, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I don't know about Star, but I appreciate it.
Bob, you're serving in the Seattle City Council, so we can't wait to talk to you about that. And I've been reading up a little bit on your successes. But before we get to that, just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got in the military, what you did in the military, and where you're from. I see you're from the great state of New York.
Well, yes, Jim. Great state of New York, Western New York, just to be clear, because a lot of people default to New York City. I'm actually from a small town between Buffalo and Rochester, New York. And the reason for that is that my parents are immigrants. I'm first generation American. My parents are from England. And after the war, my dad's eldest sister married a GI, and he was from Western New York. And so therefore, I'm from Western New York because they sponsored my dad. My dad was a welder. And so they got him a job in the local factory in my hometown, and small little ruralish hometown between Buffalo and Rochester, and so that's where I grew up. And then after that, went to school in Boston. Was looking to go ROTC, but decided not to. And instead, I went to OCS afterwards, and I was commissioned in 1990 out of Newport, Rhode Island, and then I started my career as a naval intelligence officer. And I was stationed here in the early 90s or squadron EA-6Bs up in NES Whidbey Island. And because of that experience, when I was an attaché in Russia, my choices for senior SEAL duty were either Norfolk or Bremerton. So as I tell people, I chose Seattle. And during that time, I was on the carrier Stennis heading up the intelligence department. And on that time, I met my wife, and I just tripped over the 20-year mark. And instead of pulling her into the Navy, I retired and came back to Seattle. And
Oh, your wife is from Seattle.
And as I tell people, I became a Seattleite after, first going to the UW with a GI Bill at the Evans School. And, our daughter was born here in Seattle. And most importantly, we got an Outback Subaru Outback. And then once you have the Subaru, you become a true Seattleite.
Exactly. That is funny. Bob, I was wondering, I've known you for many years. I was wondering what the connection to Seattle was. Oh, that's great. So you're not going anywhere with your wife being from Seattle.
Yes, and our daughter is now a fifth grader, and so I'm in with both feet.
That's great. That's great. Now, so Navy, so from New York. By the way, I'm from Syracuse, New York, Bob. I moved when I was a little guy to Rhode Island, and then you go in the Navy intelligence. What brought you to the White House? You served with President Clinton?
Clinton, yes. When I was in Whidbey, when I was in my the Prowler Squadron up there, I was hearing about DC. I transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I had friends who were there from like the Air Wing world. And, part of it was talking about Georgetown. So I actually started up at Georgetown when I came into DC. In fact, I was already, accepted even before I checked into the Office of Naval Intelligence. And then I also heard about the social aid program. And I put my name in the hat. And funny enough, as an intelligence officer, I was coming up for my PR, my periodic review, and I told the person, I said, well, since you're doing this PR, I just want to let you know I'm going for this program. And so I need the special clearance. She looked at me, and then she wrote it in there. And so when I had my board for the program, the social aid program, I already had that clearance. A little bit different. And by the way, quick aside, and during that interview, my first question was, or one of the first questions was, what do you do if a Hollywood starlet asks you to dance? And I looked at the questionnaire. There was 3 Navy people. Navy P306 captain, pilot was the head of the board. I looked at the questionnaire for a second, then I looked to the pilot, the '06, and I said, well, that all depends on the rules of engagement. And I think I'd gotten selected based on that question and answer right at the very beginning of the interview.
So you had no further clearance requirements when you
No,
went to the White House. Oh, isn't that funny? It took me a year and a half.
yeah, because it was already pre-done.
Isn't that funny? Collin was probably only a month, but I was like a year and a half. Well, that's cool, Bob. So tell us what it was like with President Clinton. It's been a while since I've talked to a President Clinton aide.
Well, it was great, and I volunteered for everything. And this was pre, a lot of the security changes. I used to park on the ellipse and walk in and all those pieces. And it was really good. A great group of people, which I'm sure is standard for all of us. A great group of people, but it was really interesting. The varying types of events that I would do, and I just really loved the various types. And we always had time because President Clinton wasn't necessarily on time, and so we did that. And there was always changes too. I always remember like the first couple of briefs in the East Wing, and I was like focus, laser focus. This is like an intelligence briefing. I'm taking every little piece in. Then I realized I just need to take in the big themes, the big muscle movements, because there's always going to be adjustments. And so I learned to be, as they say, semper gumby, and jump in. I jumped in on this one event, and this is really interesting. It was the first African American piece of art in a permanent White House collection. And this is October '96. You would have thought this would have been done in '76, not '96. And anyway, so they had me to go up on the riser to unveil the painting in the Oscar Tanner, Sun Dunes at Sunset, Atlantic City. It was then placed in the green room. Not sure where it is now. Anyways, I'm up there with an Army colleague on the other side. President Clinton's next to him. And I had the grandniece of the artist who's long since passed, and the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, Senator and Clinton. And it was funny because they were so close to me. If I had swung my arm out to unveil the painting in a normal kind of arc, I would have taken them both out. And so I adjusted on the fly. I 1-2 to bring it over, and I avoided controversy by not taking out the grandniece, who then would have taken out the First Lady. And then nobody was the wiser. And interestingly enough, when I left my Bremerton job, the carrier job, I take different routes between the East Coast and West Coast since I was up here in the Northwest twice. And I took I-40, and we stopped in Little Rock, and we were in the Clinton Library, my then fiance, now wife. And we're walking through, and she goes, "Oh, I know this picture." And it was a picture of me from that event there at the Clinton Library that they had out. But it would have been a bigger thing if I had taken out the grandniece and then the First Lady in one fell swoop.
Right. Probably would have been a bigger photo at the Clinton Library. That's great. Oh, that's a cool story. Tell us something about the Clintons that most people would be surprised to hear. I asked Collin this question with the Obamas, and I thought it was very cool. The time that you took out one of the kids, I think it was Collin, and how nice Mrs. Obama was in handling that afterwards. What's something about the Clintons that
I was going to say, Bob had a similar story there, almost taking people out. I mean, it seems like it's a common occurrence for social aides.
Well, you say that, but I'm thinking about another situation when it was Christmas time. I'm standing next to Ann Stock and the other deputy social secretary. And the First Lady mouthed over to us, to Miss Stock, and said, "Where's Socks, the cat?" And lo and behold, somebody ran off. Next thing you know, Socks is brought into the East Room. All the kids are there for it was night before Christmas. And they hand the president Socks. And then the president, this was a mistake on his part, he says, "Anybody want to pet Socks?" The kids bum rushed the stage. If this was adults, the Secret Service would have come out. We all know about being in groups and all this, and we're part of that process and so forth. But if adults had done what the kids had done, it was incredible. And then she looks at us, and the Marine Ranger was the lead for that event. I forget her name now, but she goes, "Do something." So we wade in to this mass of kids, and I'm trying to push them, pull them back, say, "Okay, kids, okay, very nice." And I'm ginger because I'm basically 6'3", at that point, a little under 200 pounds, and I'm like wading in, and then all of a sudden I stepped. I'm like, "Oh my God!" I looked down. This little girl looked up at me, and I just kind of touched her finger. I'm like, "Please don't scream, please don't scream," because I'm only like 10, 12 feet from the president and the First Lady. And thank God she didn't. And so that would have been another kind of incident, So we eventually got the kids back. And, funny enough, a friend of mine was the executive assistant to then Secretary Christopher at the State Department. and they happened to have C-SPAN on. And my friend told me afterwards, her and the writer were watching it, head writer, and there was like, oh, look at Bob, he's handing out gifts to the kids. And little did she know that I had just stepped on a kid's toe so gingerly. I mean, I didn't smash it, but I was like in fear that this little kid was going to shriek,
That's
a
funny.
dozen feet from the president, but thank God she didn't.
That's funny. That's great. Very cool.
But and further answer your question, one of the things I always say, particularly about the President Clinton, is he was so genuine with people. You take the politics out. He was the same way. Like I was at the 96, in the Rose Garden for the benefits, Welfare Benefits Act, that big legislation, Welfare Act from 96. And there was like there was a welfare mom from Arkansas, and he would treat her just the same as some well-to-do New York socialite that was in for whatever event.
That's great.
And he had that personal touch, and and during the Blue Room and all that, I mean, he would make people feel like they were the center of the world. I know this is probably a common trait amongst most presidents, or at least a chunk of them, but I saw it in the little things too, where people don't necessarily see it, where he was very genuine with all people. And I think that is a credit to him, that he would treat every individual as an individual, no matter their status, and treat them with respect, to include military officers. I remember one officer was, about to go to the Balkans, and Air Force Special Forces, and he actually pulled him over and had a conversation with him because somebody had told him that he was leaving the program for a period of time for the deployment.
Oh, get out.
And he talked to him and said, hey, and had a one-on-one. And as you know from Clinton, he remembers names really well, remembers faces and people, and it was on display even for social aides.
Isn't that great? That's great. Very good. And a great trait for President Clinton as well. So let's jump to your work. You're on the Seattle City Council.
Yes, I am.
Tell us what it's like. I mean, what are you doing? What are you focused on? And what excites you about being on the council, Bob?
One of the things I think about, I had a very interesting career, like being in Russia as an attaché, or when I was in Iraq and Baghdad, or our deployments and so forth. And, Kosovo, when I was at UCOM headquarters as a XO to the General Clark's intelligence officer. There's been many great times where I felt like I was living history. And like when I was in Russia, I felt like I was living in a movie. And, and a lot of us have these same experiences, because you're living this incredible life. And so, I retire, I go to the grad school and so forth. And now I got this job. And this job is a very important, big job. And it has elements of that same piece. I've told people, not so much like living in a movie, but I feel like I'm living sometimes in a TV drama, those shows on TV. Because there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of big pieces to the job. In terms of enjoyment, the big thing is it's nice to, it's a chance to make a difference. Because I'm working, because, people ask me why I ran, because I wanted my daughter to grow up in a safe city. We were having a lot of challenges post, the pandemic, post 2020 and so forth. And the leadership at that time took some policy directions that in my mind made it worse, and it created a lot of problems in Seattle. And so I felt that I had to stand up and and do what I did, particularly because the opportunity was there. And I won't get into the Seattle politics of why, but there was an opportunity for me there, and so I took it. And the bottom line is, I did want my daughter to grow up in a safe city. And when I say this to people, because if I know if they have kids, and it's for your kids too, and because we have to show that like West Coast blue cities can be run well. And that's really important. It's important for our community, but it's important for our young people, and ultimately, it's a chance to continue public service too.
That's great, Bob. Seattle's made national news with some of the improvements that it's made. You're the chair of the Public Safety Committee,
Yes, public
and
safety
you've
committee.
made some measurable improvements to some of the crime statistics.
Yeah,
So
we're setting that up, by the way, because some of the critics, some of my friends, who are in a different political lane along the spectrum, they will say national trends. But in the 2 years of this, we just had a 2-year term of the council. My term is 4 years, but and every other cycle is like the citywide, 2 citywides, and 7 districts. And I represent District 7, which is downtown, and then moving north to Queen Anne, Magnolia. generally more affluent area of the city compared to other parts of the city in those different pieces, but it's also very diverse in terms of very urban, like all the tall buildings, if you're watching the Seahawks game and you see, that view with Mount Rainier in the background, you're basically looking at my district. And so with these challenges, and this kind of goes to how I approach it, and a little bit of the military part of me is, okay, I have a mission, to create a safe base in our city. I have a vision, which I also express. And then we created the strategic framework plan for Safer Seattle. And I had 6 pillars. I just pushed on all those. It's about keeping the press on, pushing. And we passed 36 pieces of public safety legislation out of this 2-year term of the council. And a lot of this related to our, one pillar was SPD staffing. We lost so many SPD officers from Seattle PD. That was a big problem. We have turned that around where we brought on 150 plus officers this in 2025. I don't know the exact numbers. That will tally up pretty soon. And that's a sea change. And, part of this too is about leadership, which is something when people, like the people who want to dismiss what we're doing, is they don't really account for that. Because at my first committee meeting, I said to the men and women of the Seattle Police Department, give us 1 year. And then that year we showed. And at the end of the second year, I talked to an officer who's retirement eligible. And he goes, I listened to you. And you know what? The reason why I'm still here is because of the work that the council's done and what you've done as chair of public safety. And my colleagues have also, I've been to all the precincts. I talked to the officers. My colleagues have been to the precincts. And so we're showing a very different leadership model than what we had 5 years ago. And I think that really makes a difference. And then we do it with the other pieces, technology pieces that we brought on, the real-time crime center, a building, a space that was kind of laying dormant for 6 years. And then some policy pieces like after hours establishments. There was this 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Problem period. And then we also did chronic nuisance properties. And so our police chief now is using that to shut down those problematic businesses that are allowing, bad things to happen and ends up with gun violence. So we've had a major drop in gun violence between the first half of 25 and the second half of 25. And particularly in that time period, the overnight, the late night time period. And so it's about bringing these pieces in and, and making a difference. And that's what we've been looking to do on the committee, but also the council overall.
That's terrific, Bob, and very impressive. And so I want to ask you a couple of questions relating to this. You've referred to your military background. What did you experience or learn from the military that's most helped you with the progress that you've made?
I think a lot of this goes to, I always say leadership management 101. We had it right at the beginning of our careers, in my case, OCS, Officer Candidate School, Newport. And then as a JO in the, in schoolhouse, but then also like in my first squadron, my first operational command, which was a squadron, my first skipper, the leadership traits that he had. And then you have those mid-career courses where you're also getting those leadership pieces. The Navy then sent me to the Army's General Command and General Staff College. We were getting leadership 101 again and again. And then as a senior, school as well, in terms of, within naval intelligence and so forth. And so we get these kind of training, we get this experience. And then we also have all the mentor, the people that we see and work for and the lessons that we gain from them. Sometimes bad, a lot of times good. And by bringing that all together, it really helps. Really what it is, it's about having some structure. It's like having the mission and the vision, but then having the plan and having concrete pillars. And then the big thing is clarity and of communication. Like different people will tell me that I'm good at comms discipline because I just keep hitting the point again and again. And to the point now where the Seattle political world, which is to my left, I'm a moderate centrist guy, but to my left, they hear it and, and that's being taken up in a lot of ways. And so it's a big piece in terms of, if you want some type of outcome, you have to know where you're going. You have to have that North Star. You have to have the mechanism to get there. And that's something that in the military it's common, but it's not necessarily as common in the civilian world. And so that's really where the difference comes into play.
Just preparing for this talk, Bob, I went to your website and listen, it's very clear what you want to achieve. You talk about the importance of the strategy, you talk about the pillars, and then you talk about the progress that's been made. It's a very clear articulation, which in my opinion, I saw the clarity of the military past. And on really important topics, not only
Yeah.
to Seattle, but to the country. All right, here's my second question relating to what you've talked about. Let's say you were just put in charge of the nation's big cities, public safety for the nation's big cities. What are some things that you would put in place immediately that would have some measurable success? I'm springing this on you, but come on, you've done some things in Seattle, again, national attention, and you've had success. What are some things that you'd immediately put in place to be able to help improve safety, recognizing the importance of taking care of the citizens as well?
Part of it is speaking truth to power or speaking, putting the facts out. There's two things that came to my mind immediately. One is, as part of the planning process, I looked at all the issues that we have in Seattle in public safety. And I'm like, what is the common thread? What's linking? It's like link analysis. Part of this is, you say military, but it's also being in the intelligence community for 20 years, 22. And what is the links? And a common link is this idea of a permissive environment. When you have a challenge, you say, oh, and I always say lead with compassion, but then have the wisdom to look out for community in the neighborhoods. Look out for our neighbor in need, but also look out for the neighborhoods. And so it's about doing that, but then you can't excuse. I mean, do what you can for that person, but if that person is doing something wrong, from a misdemeanor felony, you have the discretion, of course, with prosecutor's discretion and so forth, and law enforcement assisted diversion, these kinds of pieces that we have, and I believe in those. But you cannot just say, "Oh no, let's just let it be," because that allows it to be permitted. And then what happens is then it's continually added on, and then so this permittedness is expanded, and it basically creates this permissive environment. And I think that is a common thread piece that we have to understand. And then it's about talking about what is the true facts. Like we have individuals on our streets that are, that you see on the news sometimes, and nobody talks about it. But I'm an intelligence officer, so I'm talking to people all the time, and I say, hey, what's going on here? And then I'm told, 15 to 40% of the people in this one problem area of Seattle actually have housing. And then people don't say anything about that. They don't put it out there. So I'm like, I'm putting it out there because you have to put it out there because then you can deal with the issue. Okay, why is 15 to 40% of the people that are, on our streets and these problematic public safety posture issues, there when they have housing? Well, it's because the housing's in poor shape. Okay, if you want to deal with the issue, you have to identify, the factors in that issue. And then if you can't have an honest discussion, and a lot of times we're like self-censoring ourselves as a community, and there's people who do it for political reasons, and I'm like, I've already been retired once, and I'm like, hey, this is who we are. And my next birthday is a milestone birthday, as I say. I reaching that I don't give two F stage of life. It's just call it out. And I think that's really important if you want to do it. And then tied to that, and this is how I've changed my pillars this year for the plan, is that we have to address the seam between public safety and human services, public safety and housing, public safety and homelessness. And there's a lot of hiccups in there. There's reasons why things start faltering. You start identifying it. It's like when you pull the onion back and you're getting extra layers and you're like, hey, what's going on here? Addressing that seam is so important. And, and I've lived this, 9/11 happened literally almost right in the middle of my career. You know about the seams with the intelligence community, but then also between intelligence and law enforcement. And so I've grown to abhor seams, and seam between UCOM and CENTCOM, like with the Cole bombing. Cole was the Sixth Fleet asset. I was at Sixth Fleet when that happened, and she was a Sixth Fleet asset within less than 48 hours before that, because it was on that seam between the two COCOMs. And so I abhor seams, and so I've identified that as another area that we need to attack. And I have to be careful the words I use. Like I just use attack, but in the political sense, I tend to try to avoid the militaristic, kind of terms, that we need to address. And and so if I was doing this nationally, and there's a lot of smart people who have done a lot of things, and a lot of these things can be these challenges that we face can be addressed. But part of it is sometimes people have like ideological blinders on, or they don't necessarily engage. And that's a big problem. And, I see that as a city council member too. There's two problems. There's two challenges for being a city council for a big city like Seattle, and the challenges that we have. One is, all these times in the Navy, I was a bachelor. Now I'm a father, husband, and a father. So there's the work-life balance challenge. But the other challenge is there's so many topics. Like, we're talking about public safety, but I'm doing land use. I'm doing all these different issues, parks, transportation, all these different pieces. And there's a lot of people who come to me and are saying, hey, and they're like, hey, you should be on board because everybody's in agreement with us. And they're like, talking about within that little space there between, that they're looking at their little environment. And I'm saying, well, yes, I hear you. And I'm taking in your different points. But as a council member, I have to come up to the 30,000 foot level. And I'm asking them, well, you're not accounting for A, B, and C on this side or X, Y, and Z on the other. I mean, they're so determined. They're like, yes, everybody's in agreement with us. And then I ask those questions coming from the 30,000 foot level. And I'm like, well, I want to work with you, but we need to adjust for, X, Y, and Z, for example, that may be sitting just outside, because whatever you do, second and third order effects, for every action, there's a reaction. And it could impact another area that you're not focused on because you are so committed to your topic. And I hear you and I thank you for that. But again, my responsibilities, that's why my plan is the strategic plan. We're the legislative branch. This is the executive branch, the mayor and the police chief, the police department, the other public safety entities that have to do the operational piece, implementation piece. My implementation is passing a piece of legislation.
Right.
And that could be hard, by the way, as a district representative, because people think of me as the mayor of District 7 here in Seattle. And that's a challenge because, the precinct captain doesn't work for me. He works for the chief. The chief doesn't work for me. I mean, he reports to me in a way because I oversee their budget and everything. But, he works for the mayor,
Right.
and then the mayor, is the co-equal branches of government kind of thing. So there's the challenge. I recognize that was a little bit of a long answer to your question.
But a good answer. Very good.
I was going to ask, in the realm of public safety, is I know that we have the World Cup is approaching, and just I'm curious, both from the standpoint, obviously being a Seattle resident, myself for a while, the concerns. I know we did an excellent job when Major League Baseball had the All-Star game. I believe it was last season, but curious as to what does that entail, more so than I feel the same way, having friends from around the country who, quite frankly, I don't think they've ever been to Washington, let alone Seattle, who have all sorts of assumptions about what the lifestyle is like out here. But interested to hear, particularly something with a lot of, it's probably going to invite quite a bit of international travel and folks from around the world to come in to enjoy the World Cup. Curious what that looks like and what kind of work goes into preparing for an event like that, and how you can leverage both what we work both as military vets as well as on the hospitality angle from being social aides, what you look to leverage in helping your colleagues prepare for that.
I think to your question regarding the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup, by the way, in my position, I have to properly, say FIFA World Cup. And I've been trained myself to say that after years of not using FIFA up front, is assisting the executive in terms of what can we do to assist to make things better. For example, and I got a lot of heat, and partly this is the executive, the former mayor, now former mayor, and his team. They should have been looking a little bit more at these issues because, like I mentioned earlier, the Real-Time Crime Center was part of the Real-Time Crime Center was also our CCTV network, and separately automatic license plate readers, which has gotten in the news a lot lately. And so we did the CCTV, and there was a lot of pushback in our city against that. And I take their input in, but again, North Star got the plan, and we need to do this. And Real-Time Crime Center, and we built a lot of protections into. People think that everything's wide open, but we built in a lot of protections on like the Real-Time Crime Center. And then, lo and behold, to Colin's question, all of a sudden, hey, we need to expand it to cover the stadium district. Where Lumen Field, soon to be called Seattle Stadium during the FIFA World Cup. The moniker is lost, it becomes Seattle Stadium. And then T-Mobile Park, where the Mariners play, which is right next door. Side by side, urban, right downtown stadiums and fields, ballparks. And that didn't have the coverage. And so they came back to us earlier this year in 25 and said, hey, we need this. And oh, by the way, since we're doing it, we should put some additionals in Capitol Hill. And then we had a problem, a challenging, on the school side where we've had some school shootings and so forth. Let's put this near this one school here in Seattle. And so I'm like, yes, I understand. Yes, we have to do it. And so we went forward on this legislation to authorize and pay for the CCTV coverage of the stadium makers district, basically where the two stadiums are. And I will tell you, there's tons of pushback. There's the protest. This is where it gets ugly. You see these scenes on TV where we're getting vilified, and it's ugly threats made against us. And I'm like, well, no, we need to do this because we need to be ready for the FIFA World Cup, because this is, we did have MLB, weekend a couple, All-Star weekend a couple years ago. Soon we're going to have the NFC Championship in Seattle. We'll be ready for that. We just had ALCS, the American Champions League Series with the Mariners. We did that. So we can do this, but the FIFA World Cup is at an additional level. And so we need to, put these pieces in place. And then a lot of this also goes in terms of coordination. And there's a lot of that builds on all, the NFL, the MLB, the hockey, NHL with the Kraken. We build on that. And then the partnerships with neighboring jurisdictions. And because of what we're dealing with too, is we don't have drones, for example. So this is where the partnership. So if you have a felony, gun involved, whatever, weapons, Seattle PD doesn't have, but that would trip the wire for King County Sheriff to come in with their drones. And we've seen this in combination with our CCTV, by the way, to great effect. It's worked perfectly. And so Collin, part of the answer is to ensure that all those pieces are in place. It's all about contingency planning, branch plans, and all the like. And we're doing that. And so then what can we do on the legislative side? That is to give the authorization, and importantly, we're budget. We have the power of the purse, just like the Congress does. And so putting those pieces in play really help the Seattle PD and the law enforcement more generally. And that's what we do in terms of ramping up for a major event like FIFA World Cup, because we're going to have 6 matches. And it's going to be interesting because one's on Juneteenth. And that would be the U.S. men's national team will be playing here against Australia. And then on, Pride Month in June, we have, just happened to be Pride weekend. We're going to have Egypt and Iran here. And the two FAs, the two football associations, are not particularly happy about that. But, this is Seattle. And so we'll need to do extra work there to ensure that we're good. And really look to ensure all T's are crossed and I's are dotted. So part of this is oversight that we do, but part of it also is setting them up for success. Key, and I say this all the time because I'm not really coming in as an activist, is what can we do for this organization to be set up for success as opposed to set up for failure? And in terms of the FIFA World Cup, it is, okay, we need to have better CCTV coverage around what will now be known Seattle Stadium during the FIFA World Cup, and also T-Mobile Park sitting right next door.
Bob, just for clarification, perhaps accuracy, you're going to host the NFC Championship game if Seattle's in the NFC Championship game.
Well, I have great confidence in the Seahawks, and so yes.
Nice.
Well, we'll find out this afternoon as we're recording the end of season. Niners and Seahawks game is going to be, being played 5 p.m. local time here, 8 p.m. Eastern.
Nice. Good, Bob. What would you tell a 26-year-old who's thinking of going into politics or thinking of serving their country in the political area? What advice would you give to them?
And answer your question, it's interesting because usually I think of it, following my own example. I think about people because the people come to me on a regular basis. I have a retired admiral friend of mine who wants to check in because they see what I'm doing here and they have interest in doing the same thing. And I say, hey, it's what I would say to my 26-year-old self too, in terms of you have to build stepping stones. And, going to the Evans School, the public administration program is great. And it was a great bridge from the military to civilian, but it's also a great stepping stone for public service, here at the local government level. And then the other thing too is you have to engage in community. And so I was a volunteer. I volunteered with the board of the World Affairs Council Seattle, which was not really a political piece, but I was also on the board of the Queen Anne Community Council, which is just a neighborhood council. Think of Georgetown in DC or Old Town within the city of
Right.
Alexandria, having
Right.
their own like neighborhood community council. So I was engaged on all the issues, and you get primed, you get like a good baseline. And so it's kind of like you prep yourself to be ready to step up and then to, bring what you bring, like the leadership management one-on-one point that military brings. And so that's the answer that, kind of, parts of the answer that I would give somebody who is just retiring, for example. Now, if there's a 26-year-old, maybe somebody who knows that they're only going to do X amount of time in the military, 6 years, 8, whatever. For them, I would say, bring something to the table. I know a lot of folks that, graduate college, maybe they go get an MPA from whatever school, and public health, there's different social work, there's different things, and then they just kind of go into politics. Well, then you're just a part of the politics machine. It's okay, the process of politics, but what are you bringing to the table? Go work in industry, whatever it may be. Go work in the tech world. Go overseas and do X, Y, and Z, and then bring that back, and bring that to the table, because that's what really helps us. We have 9 people on the city council in Seattle. 2 are citywides, and then 7 are representing the 7 districts in Seattle. So I'm bringing the military piece. And by the way, until just recently, 3 of the 9 were veterans of the 9, which is really shocks people. Going back to Collin's point about, stereotypes about Seattle. And we still have 2. One just rolled off because he was an appointment, but we still have 2 veterans. I'm a career veteran, and my colleague, did X number of years and then was in the reserves. And so, bring that piece. A colleague of mine, she's a small businesswoman. And she also has the history of being multi-generational Seattle. Bring that to the table. Bring these different pieces. One was a former one was a judge. My Air Force friend, he was an attorney, but he also worked in the tech field for both Microsoft and Amazon. And so he comes in with that experience. And so I think the key thing that I would say to somebody who's 26, build up the pieces like I talked about for those coming out of retirement, working community, volunteer, all these pieces, and then maybe get the education piece. Use that GI Bill to get a master's, whatever.
That's great.
But separately, bring something to the table. Because if the 9 people on the council all came in straight as legislative aides, like legislative assistants, like I have a chief of staff, policy director, district director, and so forth, and you just did that, and then you kind of rose up the ranks a little bit, but then you decided to jump in a race yourself, and then you become, and it's good to have that a little bit, but if all 9 were that way, that doesn't lead for, I don't think, good leadership, good governance is a key word that I use a lot, good governance. And so bringing something to the table is so very important. That would be my advice to a 26-year-old versus a 46-year-old.
Yep. That's great. Having interviewed Collin a year ago, Collin, this is something you should look at. You'd be an inspiration as a political person, as you were a military person. Okay,
I agree.
let me ask another question, springing this one on you. Having spent a couple of years now with the city council, do you have any different views on any current or past politicians? Have you changed any views on any past or current politicians based on your experience?
Well, I have great respect for a lot of politicians. By the way, I never say I'm a politician. I always say I'm a Navy guy who's now elected. It kind of goes back to my earlier point that I
Yep.
just said. But, I've gotten to know Representative Adam Smith, who represents parts of Seattle, but then also parts of the east side of Lake Washington, former chair and now ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. And so I have great respect for him and the work that he does. And, and I see that a lot of it's kind of emphasizing what I've already known. And my experience, by the way, is very similar to somebody running for Congress. I have to do the money ask. I mean, all these different pieces, political consultants, a comms plan, media plan, all these different pieces are part of what we're doing, which is very similar to somebody who's running and serving in Congress. It's just at a lower level. It has the same pieces, but it's at a lower level. And so so looking at politicians, part of it is I really respect those that put everything on the table. Remember that point I was talking about? There's people that withhold information for their own purposes. And that information could be key to solving that problem. And so I really appreciate those politicians that have the integrity to go out there and say, hey, we need to do talk about X, Y, and Z. I should say A, B, and C as well, because I have to balance out all the X, Y's, and Z's I've used in this interview. So A, B, C, and that's really, something. And with that lens, what I was just talking about, the funding, the money, the fundraising, and all that, you still have to maintain yourself in terms of your integrity and so forth. And so that kind of reveals, adversity reveals. There's a lot of crises, there's a lot of challenges in this job, and it's revealing. And so, in that revealing, you look at those people who stay on the high ground and doing it for the love of country or love a state or love a county or love a city, and are looking to step forward in a positive, engaged way.
Neat. Very good. Tell us about a book, a poem, a work of art that's inspired you. Tell us about something that now, while you're thinking about it, Collin, I asked you the same question. Do you remember what your answer was?
It's either a Grisham novel. It could have been To Kill a
Could have been-
Mockingbird. It was
You
either a
mentioned
Grisham novel or
Grisham.
it was To Kill a
You
Mockingbird.
did mention Grisham. That's right. All right, cool. Bob,
I think, in answer to your question, it's funny because there's different things you mentioned. There's books, there's poems, there's different works of art, and so forth. And during the course of budget season, budget can be kind of, because we 8 billion plus. It's big money and it's big issues, and it's really important to people's lives, and so it can be stressful. And and more than once over the course of the fall, I referenced Rudyard Kipling's "If." And I said, and I highlighted to them, the idea how it starts off. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, that's key right there. And then, going to the end, when you're in my role, people know who I am in the city and to different degrees. And I'm on the TV, on the news on a regular basis, or podcasts or interviews. But there's also at the end, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. If neither foes or loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much. And if you can fill that unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll are manned, my son. And I think Kipling's, "If" poem is, matches up well with the, the crises, the challenges that are inherent with the job. And so that was one of the first things coming up, because even over the course of this past fall, it came up, and I used it. I would tell people, don't lose your head as those about you are doing so. And I've seen this in the Navy, the crises, being deployed for Bosnia, first care deployment, later for Iraq and Afghanistan, in country in Baghdad, 2 years in Russia, which, when they invaded Georgia, and I mentioned Kosovo, and there's crises in Africa and so forth. I saw a lot of people. Some people would sit down, and then some people would stand up, but they would just run around in circles and not really accomplish anything. And what's really important is for those in those crisis situations or those difficult situations is for people to stand up and then walk forward.
that's
And
great.
in that first two lines of the "If" poem,
Great poem.
keep your head about you, is kind of goes to that. And so I'm seeing my version of it. So these are the parallels between the military and in the job, like being a council member in a major American city. That's where the parallels start showing up a little bit.
Excellent. Collin, any other questions?
No, nothing else over here. Great conversation today.
Bob, was there a question that you were dying I would ask that I did not ask that you want to answer?
I was thinking about this a little bit, and I think a standard question should be, what social aid story do you tell the most?
All right. You just typed
And
yourself.
as it turns out, I've told a few already, because I mentioned the Christmas, "'Twas Night Before Christmas" story. I mentioned almost taking out the grandniece and the first lady for the painting unveiling, but I had to adjust. And Christmas Socks the Cat and so forth. But I had two stories out of the Canadian State Dinner. Jean Chrétien came one time, and I'm in the Red Room hanging out with Dan Aykroyd, his wife Donna Dixon, and the lady Valerie Harper, who played Rhoda. And so I'm talking to Dan Aykroyd, and I grew up across the lake from Canada, across from Toronto, between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Love Canada. And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I have some places up in the St. Lawrence River. I have a place up in the St. Lawrence River." I go, "I used to go up there for vacation a little bit, up in the river with my family when I was a kid." Then I'm like, you should come with me. Because again, President Clinton wasn't on time. So I knew I had time. So I brought him into the Blue Room. And I'm looking out. I go, this is my favorite view from the White House, is to look across. And I talked about the Jefferson Memorial. And I said, oh, by the way, there's no trees here because FDR didn't want any trees because he wanted to be able to see Jefferson Memorial. And I could say, hey, look, there's Washington Monument is up there to the left. There's the Washington Monument. And these are all the pieces. So here's a funny piece about this. So later, years later, way later, Bill Murray gets the Mark Twain Prize at the Kennedy Center, and he's doing this, and he says, "Hey, take the bus, pass it around," and he's saying, "Oh, I got something old, something borrowed, something blue, Cubby blue, and so forth." And then he goes, "Yesterday, I was at the White House. The Secret Service didn't know I was there," and so everybody starts laughing. And he goes, then he got contemplative a little bit. And he goes, when you're there, and you look out, and you can see the memorials and so forth. It's democracy's real. And he's talking about this. And I'm like, that's exactly what Dan Aykroyd and I were talking about. And so when I heard that on the Mark Twain Prize, and when he accepted his acceptance speech, and he's talking about, the White House and the view from the White House, the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Memorial, Monument, and so forth, and all these different pieces. And that is what makes democracy real. That it's real. It's something that you can touch. And I had the same thing going back to that painting unveiling, and President Clinton was talking, and he looked over to the Jefferson Memorial, and he goes, and Jefferson knew better in terms of slavery and so forth. And these pieces were and that we need to do better. And that combination was something. So that's one of the stories I tell, particularly because of the Mark Twain, Bill Murray, second act of that play. That started with me saying to Dan Aykroyd, "Hey, come with me. Let's go in the Blue Room. I want to show you this view that I really love." So my question is, if you know Bill Murray or Dan Aykroyd, is that did Dan Aykroyd, after that visit for the Canadian State Dinner, later talk to Bill about his experience at the White House and looking out from the White House? And did he tell Bill that?
Right.
And did Bill internalize that? And then eventually came out in his speech for the Mark Twain Prize. That would be really interesting to know.
That's great. So Aykroyd was Canadian.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. That's why
Kingston. He's from Kingston, Ontario, where the Tragically Hip are from.
Nice. So. How many state dinners did you take part in?
I did at least 3.
Nice.
At least 3.
What were they?
I forget now. I just remember
One
how
was
things
Canada.
changed. Because I remember some of these events, we would go to the Old Abbott Grill, have a pint, and come back. And then, and then we would have dinner in the White House mess for this one was my last one. And I remember, there was a group of us, and about 3 of us were having, our last dinner, as part of a state dinner there at the White House mess. And then, we got a second bottle of wine from these 2 Secret Service guys that are at a separate table, and we were having a nice dinner. And it was really nice. And then we all went back into the mansion, the executive mansion. But I stopped off at the Situation Room because I had friends who worked there in the sit room. And I just knocked on the door just to see if they're there, just to say hello. And back to the point about what I was just talking about, Dan Aykroyd, they weren't there working that shift, that watch. And so I walked out into the West Colonnade, and I stopped, and I looked at the side of the White House. I could see the Washington Monument behind. After having a very nice dinner with, a little wine with my colleagues to celebrate our last, state dinner, and then go back and for the rest of the program. And that was another example of that. So now I have to go back and find out which were the others state dinners I did.
Oh, that's terrific. Now, before we end, make sure you say hello to Ken, our leader.
I appreciate you having me on. And, as you know, I've been active at different times to differing levels, like when I was in DC and so forth. But then I ran off to Russia, which is always an area of conversation with our founding chairman, Ken Reardon. So, given that Russia's come up more than once in this interview, I just wanted to give Ken a shout out.
That's great.
Chairman.
Great. And thanks, Ken, for everything you do with us.
That's for Novum Godum, Russian for Happy New Year.
That's great. Bob, great pleasure to see you again, and thanks for joining us. Collin, thanks for joining us as well.
All right. Thank you so much.